The fall of Terran Prime. The stars had always been cold and distant, but on this night they seemed cruel. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood on the bridge of the ESS Defiance and watched her world die. Through the viewport, Earth burned. Orange wounds spread across the surface of humanity's birthplace, each one marking the death of a city, the end of millions of lives. She had been fighting for 6 weeks straight, sleeping in 2-hour bursts when her body simply refused to function any longer. Now there was nothing left to fight for except time. The Vrexian horde had come without warning. Their bioships emerged from fold space in numbers that darkened the sensors, living vessels that bred weapons and warriors in their organic holds. They did not negotiate. They did not explain. They simply consumed. World after world fell to their acid and their hunger, each one stripped of life within days. Humanity had screamed for help. The Galactic Concord, that grand alliance of elder races, had watched from their comfortable borders and done nothing. Their ambassadors sent messages of sympathy and concern. Their fleets remained safely docked. Their analysts wrote reports explaining why intervention was not strategically viable. The humans were a young species, they noted, positioned unfortunately between Concord space and the lawless outer reaches. A buffer zone, really. Acceptable losses in the greater strategic picture. Admiral Tanaka had read those reports. She had them saved on a private server, every cold word preserved. She would remember what the galaxy thought humans were worth. Admiral, her tactical officer said, his voice cracking. Lieutenant Chun was barely 23. His parents were down there, somewhere in the fire. The Vrexian fleet is reforming. They're preparing another assault wave. Tanaka looked at the display. 12 enemy capital ships for every one of hers. The math had been impossible from the start. But math had never been the point. How many civilian transports have reached minimum safe distance? She asked. 1,700, Admiral. Carrying approximately 4 million survivors. 4 million out of 3 billion. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Signal all remaining warships, Tanaka said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this steadiness in the mirror, because her crew needed to believe someone was in control. We advance on the enemy fleet. Full attack formation. Every ship that can still fire a weapon. Chun stared at her. Admiral, that's suicide. No, Lieutenant. That's buying time. She allowed herself one moment of honesty. Those transports need another 40 minutes to reach fold space threshold. We're going to give them those minutes. Every single one. The remaining ships of Earth's fleet began to move. Cruisers with hull breaches and failing life support. Destroyers running on skeleton crews. Fighters piloted by cadets who graduated early because their instructors were dead. They formed up around the Defiance and pointed themselves at the enemy. The Vrexians broadcast. The battle across all frequencies. They wanted the galaxy to see what happened to species that resisted. They wanted fear. What the galaxy saw was a dying fleet charging into impossible odds. What they saw was humans fighting with plasma fires raging in their corridors, with oxygen bleeding into vacuum, with nothing left to protect except the hope that some of their people might escape. The Concord analysts watched and made notes about emotional irrationality and inefficient resource allocation. The Defiance lasted 18 minutes, longer than tactical projections suggested was possible. Admiral Tanaka was still giving orders when the bridge decompressed. Her final transmission, picked up by a fleeing transport, was 3 words. Keep them safe. The Vrexians declared humanity extinct. They transmitted images of burning cities and shattered warships as proof of their dominance. The Galactic Concord held a moment of silence and returned to their business. But in the dark between stars, 1,700 transport ships carried 4 million survivors toward an uncertain future. They carried scientists and engineers, soldiers and civilians, the old and the young. They carried grief and trauma and loss beyond measure. And they carried something else. Something the Vrexians had not considered and the Concord had not noticed. They carried a cold, patient fury, the kind that does not burn hot and fade, but banks itself like coals and waits. The galaxy had called humanity weak while they were bleeding. The galaxy would learn what humanity became after the bleeding stopped. The wandering years. 18 months after the fall of Earth, humanity existed in the margins. Refugee camps clustered on the edges of Concord space, built from salvaged hulls and desperate ingenuity. Mining colonies sprouted in asteroid fields, too barren for other species to bother with. Station habitats grew in the void between systems, places no one else wanted because there was nothing there worth having. The Concord allowed them to stay. That was the word they used aloud, as if humanity's survival was a gift they could revoke at any moment. They restricted human movement, limited their technology access, and debated in their grand assemblies whether the human remnant posed a contamination risk to civilized space. Commander Marcus Webb did not care what the Concord debated. He cared about keeping his people alive. He stood in the cargo bay of the ESV Persistence, watching his crew unload supplies. The ship had once been a luxury liner. Now her ballrooms held bunks for refugee families and her restaurants had become hydroponic farms. She was ugly and overcrowded, and she leaked atmosphere from a dozen patched hull breaches. She was also home to 3,000 people who had nowhere else to go. Medical supplies secured, reported Lieutenant Commander Sarah Okonkwo. She was young for her rank. Everyone was young for their rank now, because the people who should have held those positions were dead. We've got enough antibiotics for maybe 6 weeks. After that, she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. What about the payment? Webb asked. 40% of contracted rate. The Kellian merchants said they could find other escorts who would work cheaper. They said humans should be grateful for any work at all. Webb's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. Anger was a luxury they could not afford. Log the discrepancy. Add it to the others. The others. A growing list of broken promises and changed terms and subtle exploitations. The galaxy had learned quickly that desperate people would accept desperate conditions. Human ships took the contracts no one else wanted. Convoy escort through pirate-infested corridors, pest clearance on abandoned stations, salvage work in irradiated debris fields. They came back with holds full of supplies and crews depleted by casualties. It was not a sustainable existence. It was survival, measured in days. But survival was enough. Survival was the foundation on which everything else would be built. In a converted storage facility on Station Gamma 7. Dr. Amara Okonkwo Sarah's mother worked through her 19th consecutive hour. Around her, a dozen researchers hunched over salvaged equipment and improvised instruments. The room smelled of chemicals and recycled air and exhaustion. On the table before her lay the remains of a Vrexian warrior. They had recovered it from a wrecked bioship, one of the few pieces of enemy technology humanity had managed to capture. For months, she had been studying its biology, mapping its neural structure, understanding how the Horde's organic technology functioned. The integration is remarkable, she murmured. More to herself than to her assistant. The warrior's nervous system is directly linked to the ship's control matrices. They don't pilot their vessels, they become their vessels. Her assistant, a former xenobiology student named David Chun, no relation to the lieutenant who had died on the Defiance, looked up from his own work. Can we replicate it? Not directly. But we can learn from it. Dr. Okonkwo pulled up a holographic display, showing a network of interconnected research stations hidden throughout human-controlled space. We're studying everything we can get our hands on. Rexian biotech, Concord systems, salvaged alien equipment. We're learning what works and what doesn't. We're innovating in ways that comfort and complacency have never demanded of the elder races. In the refugee camps, children were growing up. They learned to survive on nothing, to fix broken systems with inadequate tools, to function in environments that would have killed their grandparents. They did not learn stories of Earth's greatness or humanity's proud history. Those stories felt hollow now, memories of a world that no longer existed. Instead, they learned a different lesson. In crowded bunks and rationed meals, in patched pressure suits and recycled air, the adults taught them to remember. Remember the burning cities. Remember the unanswered calls for help. Remember the Concorde's silence. Remember what they did when we were bleeding. The Concorde called humanity refugees, scavengers, a broken species clinging to existence on the galaxy's charity. Their analysts predicted gradual decline, cultural dissolution, eventual absorption into other populations. Humans were a historical footnote, they concluded. A minor species that had reached too far and paid the price. They did not see the hidden research stations. They did not count the ships being rebuilt with salvaged Rexian components. They did not notice the training programs running in abandoned cargo bays, where children learned to fight with a focus that bordered on obsession. They did not understand what humanity was becoming in the dark. 5 years passed. The Persistence continued her endless rounds, and Commander Webb's hair turned gray. Dr. Okonkwo's research network grew, connected by whispers and encrypted transmissions. The children became teenagers, then young adults, shaped by hardship into something harder than their parents had ever been. And in the outer reaches, the Rexian horde began to stir again. They had finished digesting the worlds they had conquered. They were hungry for more. This time, they turned their eyes toward the comfortable heart of the galaxy. This time, they wanted Concorde space. The elder races, who had watched humanity burn without lifting a finger, were about to learn what it felt like to face the horde alone. The return, the Rexian horde hit the Concorde border worlds like a living tide. Their bioships emerged. From fold space in waves, each one carrying warriors bred for slaughter and weapons that grew from organic matrices. The elder races, who had spent centuries developing automated defense systems and mercenary contracts, discovered that their comfortable preparations were not enough. Colony after colony fell. The Kellians, with their merchant fleets and trade networks, watched their outer territories burn. The Drethi, proud warriors who had not fought a real war in generations, found their ceremonial combat skills inadequate against an enemy that did not observe ritual or honor. The Voss, who relied on technological superiority, learned that their machines could not adapt as quickly as creatures that evolved in real time. Within 3 months, the horde had penetrated deep into Concorde space. The Grand Assembly, which had debated human refugee policy with such careful deliberation, now met in emergency sessions that stretched through sleepless nights. They needed help. They needed soldiers willing to fight and die against an enemy that showed no mercy. They needed humanity. Ambassador Chen Wei stood before the Concorde Assembly and listened to their appeals. She was 63 years old, her hair silver, and her eyes carrying the weight of 5 years spent watching her people struggle. She had lost her husband on Earth and her son in a pirate attack 2 years later. She had nothing left to lose except her dignity, and she was not planning to lose that. The High Speaker of the Assembly, a Kellian whose name translated roughly as abundant prosperity and trade, made humanity an offer. Citizenship for survivors, territory in the outer systems, recognition as a member species of the Concorde. In exchange, humanity would fight. "You offer us now," Chen Wei said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, "what we begged for 5 years ago. When our cities burned, you offered sympathy. When our children died, you offered reports. When we asked for ships and soldiers and any help at all, you offered us the privilege of being an acceptable loss. The chamber fell silent. The elder races were not accustomed to being spoken to this way. We accept your terms, she continued. Humanity will fight. We remember what the Vrexians are. We remember what they do. But you should understand something. She paused, letting the silence stretch. We are not the species you watched die. We are what grew from the ashes. 3 weeks later, the human fleet emerged from the asteroid fields and hidden stations where it had been building in secret. The Concord observers expected refugee ships and converted freighters, the desperate remnants of a broken military. What they saw was something else entirely. Admiral Yuki Tanaka scarred, older, rebuilt from the wreckage of the Defiance by medical technology that humanity had developed during their years in exile, commanded from the bridge of the ESS Remembrance. The ship was ugly by Concord standards, all angular armor and exposed weapon systems, with none of the elegant curves that elder race designers favored. It was also twice as heavily armed as any Concord vessel of comparable size. The human fleet numbered 200 warships. They had been built from salvage and innovation, from reverse-engineered Vrexian biotech and stolen Concord designs and desperate human creativity. Every system had been optimized for one purpose: killing the enemy as efficiently as possible. There was no wasted space, no comfortable quarters, no unnecessary equipment. The ships were weapons, and so were the people who crewed them. The first major engagement came at Stellars 4, a Drethi colony world under siege. The Vrexian fleet outnumbered the human relief force 3-to-1 acceptable odds by Horde standards. Their commanders expected another easy victory, another world to consume. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the Vrexian fleet was debris. Human casualties were significant. They always were. But the footage that spread across Concord space showed something the elder races had never witnessed. Human ships advanced into fire that should have broken any species. Human soldiers boarded Vrexian vessels in close combat, fighting in corridors that reeked of alien biology, taking losses that would have routed any Concord force. They did not retreat. They did not hesitate. They fought with a synchronized fury that seemed to embrace death rather than fear it. Admiral Tanaka gave a single interview after the battle. A Kellyan journalist asked her how humans could fight with such disregard for their own survival. "You misunderstand," she replied. "We have tremendous regard for survival. We spent 5 years surviving when the galaxy expected us to die. But we learned something in those years." Her eyes, one of them replaced by a cybernetic implant that glowed faintly in the light, held no warmth. "We learned that there are things worth dying for. And we learned that the Vrexians are not among them. They are simply obstacles to be removed." The war turned. World by world, system by system, the human fleet drove the Horde back. They liberated Concord colonies and continued pushing, reclaiming the dead worlds of human space, forcing the Vrexians to retreat toward their own territory. The elder races watched with growing unease. They had wanted human soldiers to die for Concord security. They had not expected humans to become the dominant military force in the galaxy. They had not expected to fear their saviors, but humanity was not finished. Not yet. Not until the lesson was complete. The Reckoning. The Vrexian homeworld burned under an orange sky. Admiral Tanaka stood on the bridge of the Remembrance and watched the last bioship break apart in the atmosphere, its organic hull consumed by fire. Around her, officers monitored the final stages of the assault. Ground forces were mopping up the last resistance. The Horde's breeding pools were being systematically destroyed. 18 months ago, the Vrexians had sent desperate pleas for negotiation. They offered to return conquered territories. They offered reparations. They offered to withdraw to their own space and never trouble the galaxy again. Admiral Tanaka had granted them the same mercy they had granted Earth. None. Admiral Lieutenant Commander Chun reported, the son of the Lieutenant Chun who had died on the Defiance, now serving in his father's place. All primary objectives secured. The Vrexian horde is extinct. Tanaka nodded slowly. There should have been satisfaction in this moment. Instead, she felt only a tired emptiness. Revenge completed was just grief with nowhere left to go. Signal the fleet, she said. The war is over. Set course for Concord space. The galaxy expected humanity to celebrate. They expected grateful refugees returning to their place on the margins, thankful for the opportunity to have served. The Concord Assembly prepared ceremonies of recognition and carefully worded speeches about interspecies cooperation. What they got was Ambassador Chen Wei, standing before them once again. Humanity presents its terms, she said, without preamble or diplomatic niceties. Behind her, a holographic display showed the current deployment of human fleets. 200 warships now expanded to nearly 500. Positioned throughout former Vrexian space and along critical Concord trade routes. First, humanity will not be returning to the marginal territories we were assigned. We will retain administrative control of the border regions we bled to defend, including the former Vrexian systems. The chamber rustled with protest. The High Speaker rose to object, but Chen Wei continued without pause. Second, humanity will have full voting rights in the Concord Assembly, weighted by our military contribution to collective security. Given that our forces currently represent 83% of the Concord's combat capability, we expect appropriate representation. Third, humanity will build its own shipyards, research facilities, and defense networks without Concord oversight or restriction. We will determine our own future. Now the chamber erupted. Delegates shouted objections. The High Speaker called for order. Several representatives stormed toward the exit, declaring that humanity had become as great a threat as the Vrexians. Chen Wei waited for the noise to subside. Then she activated a secondary display. For those who object, she said quietly, I offer this reminder. The display showed recordings from 5 years ago. Emergency transmissions from burning cities. Desperate pleas for military assistance. Formal diplomatic requests for refugee support. And alongside each one, the Concord's response. Delays. Deferrals. Strategic assessments explaining why intervention was not viable. Reports describing humanity as an acceptable loss. You call this weak, Chen Wei said, her voice carrying through the silent chamber. While we were bleeding, you measured our worth by our suffering and found us wanting. You watched our children die and calculated whether helping us would affect your trade margins. She paused, letting the weight of history settle over the assembly. So we stopped asking for your approval. We stopped hoping for your rescue. We built something new in the dark, out of salvage and spite, and the absolute determination to survive. And now you will deal with what we have become. The High Speaker attempted one final objection. This is not what we agreed. The terms of human service were... The terms, Chen Wei interrupted, were written by you, for your benefit, when you believed we had no other options. You were wrong. She turned to address the full assembly. Humanity is not asking for permission. We are informing you of how things will be. You may accept this and work with us as partners. Or you may reject it and discover what it means to oppose the species that destroyed the Vrexian horde. The vote was not unanimous, but it was overwhelming. The Concord had no choice in the years that followed. Scholars from a dozen species would study humanity's resurgence. They wrote theories about human adaptability, human resilience, the peculiar human capacity to transform suffering into strength. They analyzed the technological innovations developed in refugee camps, the military tactics forged in desperate battles, the social structures that had maintained cohesion through 5 years of exile. But the humans who had lived through it knew the truth was simpler than any academic theory. They remembered the silence when they called for help. They remembered the galaxy's indifference to their suffering. They remembered every report that called them expendable, every negotiation that treated their survival as a bargaining chip, every moment when the Concord could have helped and chose not to. And they remembered the promise they had made to themselves in those refugee camps, whispered in the dark like a prayer. Never again, and never forget who left us to die.